Turkey. So we heard, most of us heard Fatmah's presentation yesterday, and he talked about how there's been a spike in anti-Semitism recently in Turkey, and how we can attribute this to internal and external factors. And I think my basic assessment of the situation is that the factors that I would attribute to the great increase in the amount of anti-Semitism is probably the media frames. And for those of you who aren't familiar with framing, it's a social science theory that talks about how things are interpreted and how they're portrayed. So I would say that the use of the media and the interpretation that they put forth in the recent Gaza invasion is a big factor in making people get out on the streets and protest. And some of you have probably seen the pictures of the protests in 2009 on the streets, and hundreds of thousands of people, in some cases, some estimates, almost 1 million people in some cities in Turkey were out there protesting. And when I saw some of the pictures, I was thinking I was looking at an Arab country, and I didn't even recognize Turkey. I mean, you see Palestinian flags everywhere, and their scarves, and it was just unbelievable. So I attribute also the growth of the civil society organizations in Turkey within the last 10 years, and these are Islamist civil society organizations that have effectively mobilized a great percentage of women, because most of these organizations were created under the precepts of giving women with a headscarf the right to go to university or not be discriminated against. So once these organizations were created, there was an easy base and an easy way to mobilize these women and their families to become anti-Semitic. And you'll see the protests, and if you look at the pictures on the internet, and you go to the websites, they sound like they're human rights organizations or they're working for a particular cause, but when it comes right down to it, I mean, they're just ways to further anti-Semitic behavior. So I think that there's not very much attention has been given to these Islamic civil society organizations, but I think they're a big way to mobilize at the grassroots level. I mean, most people look at what's going on with the politicians, and of course Erdogan and his AKP party are a very important factor in all this as well, but it doesn't get down to what's explaining what's going on the street. So I chose this topic because I was interested in media and how they portray anti-Semitism, and political cartoons is just a part of this, obviously. Television and newspapers and other media outlets have a very important role in pushing an anti-Semitic message in Turkey. So I won't bore you with the details of the literature, but just to point out some facts about what are the debates surrounding political cartoons and the analysis of them in the academy. Many political scientists and other scholars point at the importance of political cartoons, but they say that there isn't enough attention given to them because they don't exactly fit neatly into any one particular discipline. So since it's sort of an interdisciplinary way of looking at things, that's why it's not studied very well. But as we all know, political cartoons resonate very widely among the public. They've led to murders and riots and various other problems. And so yesterday, Rafat mentioned Vakit newspaper. It's one of the most radical Islamist newspapers in Turkey. And if you have an article about yourself published in that newspaper, and you're not a radical Islamist, obviously you have to fear for your life. So it's serious business when someone from a secular Turk is described, or there's an article written about him or her in Vakit newspaper. And some of the cartoons that I'll be showing you come from that newspaper, and I would say that they are the more virulently anti-Semitic cartoons as opposed to more of the mainstream newspapers. So let's get started. So there's 3 major incidents that created this kind of outpouring of anti-Semitic rhetoric and cartoons and everything else in the media. So the Gaza situation in 2009, and that I think created the greatest magnitude of cartoons that's available in the press. The second incident was Ireland and Wuppertal, and that happened in January of 2010. Basically, it was just a diplomatic incident. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but in Israel, Danny Ayalon, invited to Cole, who had just started his post as the Turkish ambassador to Israel 3 months before, and he said, well, we're going to talk and meet about and see what we can talk about. And the conversation turned into a debate about this television program in Turkey that had shown some anti-Semitic images. So when they were talking about it, at the end of the conversation, I guess Ayalon said something in Hebrew to the cameraman that Cole didn't understand, but later it was translated in Haaretz that he said something like, notice the low chair, notice that I'm not smiling, and notice that there's no Turkish flag on the desk. So later on, the Turks said, oh, how could they put our ambassador on a chair that was lower than the others? And so, I mean, in all actuality, even if the chairs were equal, the guy is so tiny that he would look so small next to the other guy anyways. But that's neither here nor there. But this turned into another incident on all kinds of cartoons published about with chairs, and Ireland was then later eating a chair. So anyways. Okay, and then the last most recent incident is the Marmara flotilla. And when this incident happened, I was actually in Tajikistan, but I was kind of tracking what was going on Facebook, and my friends who had never ever said anything anti-Semitic in their lives in Turkey were now posting anti-Semitic articles online and saying, how could Israel do this? So I basically thought, well, Turkish-Israeli relations, that's probably the end of them. So then when I went to Turkey a couple days after this incident, I was probably there July 1st or 2nd, something like that. I was just talking to random people around what they thought about it, and some of them were saying, oh, we're glad someone's Islamist got killed, less trouble for us. So it wasn't as serious as I thought when I was around there. Like, people weren't taking it seriously. And several days after that, there was kind of a diversion because there were some soldiers killed in the east of Turkey by PKK. So kind of the media shifted its attention to what was going on there. But it was an effective way for the secular Turks to kind of blame the whole incident on the AKP. And there's a cartoon sort of relating to that I'm going to show you later. Okay, so these are some of the earlier images coming out from the Gaza incident. And as you can see from the first one, I guess there wouldn't be too much to say like who's attributing blame, that you could just say that there's violence and there's a problem in Gaza. Then by the one on the right, it's clearly blaming Israel for all the problems. The caption on the bottom says the ceasefire has been established. The one on the right side doesn't say anything more, it just says that it was published in this section. Okay. So one of the media frames that I talked about in my paper is one that they use based upon children. So we see a lot of cartoons that revolve around children being tortured, killed, or their parents being taken away. And this was also reflected in a lot of television broadcasts in Turkey at the time. And still, while I was even there, they were showing Palestinian children crying over their parents being imprisoned. And so here we see the Grim Reaper. The child was hiding in the robe of the Grim Reaper while his presumably father is being shot by the troops. Okay, now this one I came across, I used newspaper sources as well as this website called IranCartoon.com, where it's a kind of international collection of cartoons that have been submitted to this website or have been in competitions worldwide. And a lot of these have actually circulated more widely on the internet as opposed to the ones in the newspapers. So when I first saw this, I couldn't decide whether it was Freddy Krueger or Dracula. But then when I went to save the file, it clearly said Dracula there. So as you can see on his sleeve there, he has a small Star of David, and the shape of the knife is obviously Gaza. So he's Gaza. Okay, so this one is supposedly celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Gaza invasion. That's what it says in the Gaza massacre anniversary on the left. And the soldier is saying, happy birthday, come on, blow it out. And Perez is replying with, if I blow it out, the fire will go out, let it completely burn, and then I'll blow it out later. So again, it's almost going along with the blood libels that they're drinking the blood of the children and taking along those lines. And another interesting theme that comes out in the cartoons is linking the U.S. with Israel. In some of the cartoons, it's obvious that the artist wants to give the interpretation that the U.S. is controlling Israel. But in others, you really can't tell what's going on. So here we have the U.S. and Abed is the abbreviation for USA in Turkish, and whoever it is holding a fly swatter in the shape of the Star of David and swatting out the Palestinians. So another obviously media frame is that the Palestinian is helpless and he's not doing anything and he's just being broken down by the evil Israelis. Okay, so this is one of the cartoons from the Radical Islamist newspaper that I mentioned. So we have a doctor with a head that's a globe that's supposed to be like a world opinion, and he's saying, you don't even have humanity in you don't even have, you're not even like an animal. So he's showing him the x-ray, obviously, of whatever he is, and so he's basically saying, you're not even better, you're worse than an animal. And in Turkish, that's kind of a really, really bad insult. Okay, here's another one of the cartoons that plays upon the imagery of children, and this artist chose a little girl, which is a little bit less common. Most of the time you see little boys being killed, but this is the little girl jump roping, and that's her soul going up to heaven, and the soldier is watching. Okay, this is playing upon an awful image, I guess we could say, from the cartoon website. It was submitted as part of the competition. So, I mean, you can see that the hands are just giant and kind of like an ogre or something like that. And it's just playing upon the emotions of the audience. Okay, here we have another cartoon linking Israel and the U.S. So the U.S., along with Israel, is feeding dollars into the Grim Reaper to kill the Palestinians. Okay, and here's another one of the quite disturbing ones. If you can sort of tell the Palestinians or the people living in Gaza are being buried alive there underneath the ground. Okay, and the one from the left is from Sabah newspaper, which is not really a radical Islamist newspaper, sort of mainstream. And the caption says where they're eventually going to end up, and they mean Israel, and at the bottom says at the depths of hell. And there we go at the right side again. A school child is sitting there doing his homework while the caption says his last look. So that's what he sees before he's getting killed. Okay, and then there were a lot of cartoons that had Uncle Sam in them. So on the left side, Uncle Sam is saying, this should be the last time, okay? So like he's putting the Israeli soldier on his lap and saying, you shouldn't have any more fights, no more problems. And on the right side, you could link that up with the blood libels. He's squeezing the towel, which is shaped like Gaza, into the hat to collect blood. So Uncle Sam, and I think in Turkey, I noticed a lot of times this year when I was there, a lot of the anti-Americanism and Dr. Fellow mentioned the Pew study yesterday, and along with an increasing amount of anti-Semitism, Turkey is number 2 after the Palestinian territories for the amount of anti-Americanism as well. So these two kind of go hand in hand. But if you talk to Turks, they'll say, oh, we're not against the American people, we're just against the government. And the same thing can be said for anti-Semitism. They'll say, we just oppose what Israel is doing, we're not against the Jewish people. But this summer I noticed a lot of people blaming every single problem that Turkey or the world has on the US, and they were saying the US is plotting to ruin the Turkish economy, and that the US and the Europeans are trying to resurrect the Byzantine Empire in Turkey, and this is coming from educated military. And if the military is thinking this way, I mean, who else can we expect to be thinking like this? Okay, and some of the cartoons, actually, it's sort of rare that they depict actual people in the cartoons. I mean, I guess that may be because the Turkish Republic is not exactly familiar with Israeli politicians. But I found a couple that had some actual people in there. It says the Israeli Chief of Staff, Schmid, is in Ankara. So he's visiting Ankara, and you can see everyone is horrified and just terribly afraid of him. Okay, this is another one from Veterans. And you can see that Israel is depicted as just a terrible cowboy kind of. I saw a lot of the cartoons like where Israelis look like cowboys. I guess in the Turkish culture, cowboys are considered like wild and unruly. Okay, here's another one where the Israeli soldiers drinking the blood out of the drain that looks shaped like Gaza. And this is another type of humanitarian aid. They're saying that they need to send Israel kindness and humanity and like law and justice. This is from Vakit, the Radical Islamist newspaper. So Jews are being compared to sharks. Yeah. This one circulated pretty widely on the internet. It shows a Palestinian mother with her child who has a rock in his hand, getting ready to throw the rock while she's being gunned down with a firing squad. This came from a magazine called Economics, and it's generally supposed to be about economic topics. And the caption says, Israel is continuing to drink blood. So you can see that the blue flag there is national. Okay, this one is interesting because it's supposed to be Netanyahu's 10 commandments. You're not going to help anyone, you're going to attack everyone, you're going to kill everyone, you're going to murder them, you're going to make them suffer, you're going to covet your neighbor's land, you're going to steal, you're going to trick. You're going to do your work by trickery. Okay, so this is the chair incident, and that's how it's been reflected in the media. So there were several of those cartoons with the skulls kind of calling up the Holocaust imagery. The bottom one, the chair says, I don't want any problems with Turkey, I'm regretful. The one on the right says, the guy enters in the room and says, the Israeli ambassador is here, and Cheikh Kol, who was the Turkish Israeli ambassador, says, let him wait 1 minute while he's sawing off the place of the chair. Okay, this is a depiction kind of what technically what happened, but the chair is gigantic with the Israeli flag, and Ayalon is sitting there while Cheikh Kol is sitting on a stool, and he's gigantic, which is actually the opposite. And then Ayalon there on the top is saying, good thing that the chair's legs were short while he's having to eat it. This one is a segue kind of into the Mavi Marmara incident. There's Netanyahu sitting on the little boat there, and it says at the bottom, the low chair revenge. Okay, so here are some of the images from the latest incident. So the two men on the ship are saying, I thought that our load was humanitarian aid, wasn't it? What's their problem? And so then his last word is, I guess that they have no relationship with humanity, or they're not humans. And the soldier at the bottom saying, how would you raise your hands at me while you should stop? The one on the top, the two Israeli soldiers are talking amongst themselves and saying, I think we're going to win this war. And the other one says, maybe, but we definitely lost the visual war. And then the one on the right is kind of turning around the size imagery of the previous one, and he says attack, and there's just a little tiny paper boat there. And the one on the left is just blood dripping out of the bullet holes. And the one on the right, I'm almost done, is the secular Turks' attempt to blame the Mavi incident on the AKP. So the side on the left says the people getting off before the voyage starts, and the side on the right says those who got off after the voyage. So we have coffins on the right side, and the AKP, after they orchestrated the whole situation, they're getting off before the boat takes off. Okay, thank you.
Marianna, Scherini, and what I will be discussing with you today is part of the research I conducted for my PhD, which I have recently completed at Siena University in Italy. And with that, with the image of Israel and of Israeli in the European press from 1967 till 1982. This paper focuses only on the September 1982 Lebanese events, and particularly on two events which immediately followed the assassination of Lebanese President-elect Bashir Gemayel on September the 14th, and which brought, at the time, the Middle East dramatically back into the limelight for the two following weeks. These events were the military intervention in Israel that Israel started after the assassination, and of course the massacres in the Palestinian refugees camps of Sabra and Shatila from September the 16th to the 18th. The paper analyzes the coverage of events in 5 major mainstream newspapers from 3 European countries. These include the conservative Corriere della Sera and the left-wing La Repubblica for Italy, and the conservative The Times and the left-wing The Guardian for the UK, and the left-wing Le Monde. And so the analysis primarily builds on news articles aiming at examining the features of the Israeli that were conveyed by the press in their reporting of events through correspondences and reportages. You can read the name of the main journalists who covered the events at the time on the slide. So the current debate, as we heard this morning as well, on new anti-Semitism often points out the media as one of the main sources of today's anti-Semitism in European society because of its representation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the majority of opinions underline the media liability for depicting the state of Israel as a collective Jew, thus providing a convenient channel for the outpouring of prejudices and sometimes hatred against the Jews in general. Yet the issue is controversial, and opinions, as formulated during the last decade's debate, diverge on the main question of whether and when anti-Zionist contents or criticism of Israel turn into anti-Semitic discourse. The main tendency when analyzing the media discourse on Israel is to trace back and expose the common roots between past anti-Semitic stereotypes and today's representation of Israel. This paper argues that although based on utterly negative features, yet the image of Israel and of the Israeli conveyed by the press at the time did not belong to a classic anti-Semitic discourse, or traditional anti-Semitic discourse. Although not entirely disconnected from past anti-Semitic representation, the blood libel was one of the main pattern of the prejudice at the time as well, as it is today. Nevertheless, this feature, the features of the image of the Israeli, generated an image specifically belonging to the Israelis, conveying a new set of stereotypes about them. At the same time, by conveying a new perception of the role of the Jewish communities from the diaspora vis-à-vis Israel, the press indeed represented Israel as the collective Jew. However, the diaspora Jews were compared to the image of the Israelis. That is, diaspora Jews were observed through the lens of the new representations of Israel rather than vice versa. About the military operation, which started after the assassination of Scherini. With the exception of The Guardian, the press interpreted the Israeli military operation in West Beirut, denying any tactical or strategic purpose to Israel. Accordingly, the military intervention was explained by the emotion driving the Israeli leadership, particularly Prime Minister Begin and Defense Minister Scherini at the time. And newspapers spoke of their dreams, desires, and ambition. The interpretation of the operation as originating in irrational impulses was bolstered by the approach the newspapers adopted towards the military events. News articles describing those events on extremely general terms, often through a highly metaphorical language, and they superficially reported, for instance, and I quote from some of those articles, gunfire and shooting, tanks progressing with confident slowness, combat aircraft flying low over the city, forces tightening their grip against residential areas of West Beirut, unspecified residential area of Beirut. Moreover, the newspaper's correspondents and special envoys suggested that the action was directed against civilians, instead, as it was against armed militiamen, which stayed in Beirut after the evacuation of the PLO leadership the previous month. For instance, Le Monde reported the news on a broad report by the special envoy in Beirut, as follows: "With fierce missile, they wake the city, and soon they throw people into shelters. The grip tightens on all sides, and just before 8, the assault is launched. Tanks and commandos come up from the sea, panic. Cars rush to a safe shelter. Women run, a baby in their arms, towards the nearest shelter. Men follow them, carrying bread and water." There's no reference to any action conducted against armed militiamen in this broad report, which appeared on the Le Monde's first page. And only The Guardian gave a different account. It was the only newspaper to report a sequence of events as well as the way the attack was conducted, together with the indication that the operation had taken place in an area which was the stronghold of Palestinian militias. The newspaper's account therefore proves that information about what was going on was in fact available, and that through this information events could be accounted for in a more comprehensive way than how they were described on the other newspapers. The alarming Lebanese situation took a dramatic downturn with the massacres in the Beirut Palestinian refugees camp, and from September the 19th, news of the massacres made top headlines in the newspapers. And news related to these events monopolized the front pages of all newspapers during the following week. The first accounts in the press focused on Israel's role in the massacres, also highlighted in headlines and leads. In fact, whilst rapidly reporting that the material executioners of the massacres were confusedly identified by survivors as belonging either to the Falangist militias, the militia commanded by the assassinated president, famine the Jemiahs, or to the Christian militia commanded by Major Haddad, who was a military renegade and Israel's closest ally in southern Lebanon. All reports mainly explore Israeli leaders and soldiers' responsibilities, either based on available information or in a hypothetical way. Actually, from the beginning and during the following days, this issue constituted the center of attention of the majority of commentaries and editorials as well as news articles. Various newspapers blamed Israel with different degrees of responsibility. Two left-wing newspapers, Le Monde and La Repubblica, ascribed to Israel a direct involvement in the massacres. Le Monde first leading article commenting on the massacres, for instance, asserted that with this episode, Israel has reached the limits of the crazy logic which belongs to begging, and is a paranoid folly which identifies every Palestinian as a terrorist, and therefore each Palestinian is believed to be one, the absolute evil to exterminate. Similarly, the Republica's leader explicitly identified Begin and Sharon as the architects of the massacres. The Corriere della Sera ambiguously evoked an indirect Israeli involvement. Most of the news articles refer to the fact that Israeli soldiers were only indirectly involved for having failed to stop the killers, in spite of their position along the camp's perimeter. Nevertheless, the newspaper's leading article assigned a major responsibility to the Israeli government, although it did not accuse the Israeli leaders of planning the massacres. Similarly, in leading articles and opinions, the British newspapers accredited the thesis of Israel's indirect responsibility for having failed to stop the massacres and for being somehow involved with the alleged killers at the military and political level. Two in-depth documentary reports, which appeared on the newspapers when more information had been gathered, focused exclusively on Israel's role, aiming at establishing what the position and involvement of the Israeli troops was, as well as the degree of government's responsibility that could be inferred from available information and official declarations goes out to the allegation made by Minister Sharon at the Knesset that Falangist militias had carried out the massacres, which was corroborated by evidence gathered by Israeli journalists in Lebanon at the same time, was either completely ignored or explicitly denied as fraudulent by the press. The Guardian was the only newspaper having pointed to the Maronite militia chief, Elias Hobeika, as indicated by Sharon, as the author of the massacres, and was also the only newspaper having explored the consequences these entailed for Lebanon, even after Bashir Jemai's brother, Amin, was elected at the Lebanese presidency. The Maronite, Jemai. The press also ignored the motivations behind the militia's action. They never inquired it. On the contrary, Israeli purposes in organizing or allowing the massacres were discussed in depth. All newspapers considered that one of the reasons behind the massacres was, as La Repubblica put it, the intention of the Israeli to disperse the refugees in order to prevent national and cultural unity, which would favor information of armed groups. This comment clearly assumes a political and strategic motivation to Israel's involvement in the massacres, although a brutal one. It is the only version presented by The Guardian. However, this interpretation was marginal, and the massacres were more often interpreted as deriving from Israeli leadership's willingness to annihilate Palestinians, a desire belonging to the rational sphere beyond any political or military rationale. The Italian newspapers and Le Monde assigned the massacre responsibility to Israel, suggesting, using a comparison to World War II, that the Israelis were in fact animated by a desire of extermination similar to the one suffered by the Jews during that period. La Repubblica held that the Jewish people had undergone a process of mutation in Israel, by introducing the idea of an Israeli disease as the key to interpret events. This issue of Israeli disease appears in 10 editorials during the 2 weeks. The newspaper found the origin of the disease characterized as the emergence of a systematic and uncontrollable violence both at the level of the leadership and amongst the entire society in the Jewish character of the state. In the early war of the Genius sculpturing, the origin of the disease is primarily psychological. Israel has introjected part of the violence it has suffered from over centuries, and now that it can, it gives it back furiously. From sacrificial victim, it has become the executioner. Le Monde considered, much like Italian newspapers, that Israeli leaders, for years at YIISA, was one of the primary motivations to the massacres. It features several comments which assign this irrational feeling to humiliation the Jews has undergone in Israel. Finally, the Times did not focus on the reasons behind the massacres. Nevertheless, a comment by the Cairo correspondent of Fisk, who covered the events for the most part, made the idea that the massacres were to be understood as an Israeli obsession, as it put it, vis-à-vis terrorism, and replacing once again the Israeli motivation primarily in an irrational sphere. Following the massacres, newspapers conveyed the image of, in their own words, another Israel, which referred not only to what was in the newspaper's judgment the finest part of the Israeli citizenship, but also to diaspora Jews. The reactions of the Israeli civil society to the massacres received from the beginning the attention of the press. News articles and correspondences from Israel described Israeli citizens as anguished, distraught, as well as ashamed because of what had happened in the refugees camps. However, these feelings were never further explored, and the analysis of the Israeli society was limited to the investigation of political parties and political events. The newspapers, on the other hand, put in close relation from the start the Israeli reaction to that of the Jewish communities in the diaspora. Both issues appeared in articles which were placed side by side on front and inside pages. As was the case with the Republica's front page on the 24th of September. Several articles across the press reported on the official declaration of the international Jewish community vis-à-vis the massacres and covered large and small initiatives promoted by Jewish institutions or groups. A protest organized by a few dozen of Jews in Rome was therefore compared to a 400,000 people demonstration against the massacres in Tel Aviv. While the views of individual Israelis were either marginal or ignored, on several occasions news articles conveyed the opinions of individual national citizens that explicitly identified as Jews and gave prominence to interviews with intellectuals and community leaders, as was the case in this case. And here is another example of the Times. The image is not very good, but there is a correspondence from Israel on the left and the reaction of the British board and the American Jews on the right. Clearly, the quality of the articles conveying the reaction of the diaspora Jews was superior to the one received to the Israelis' reaction. In addition, the repetition of these articles gave the impression that the members of the other Israelis that we talked about were first and foremost diaspora Jews, whose image was highly conflicting with the negative one which represented Israel in the news. The link between diaspora Jews and the Israelis as conveyed by the newspaper can be clearly identified, for instance, in this comment by the creator of Sarah. It was commenting a demonstration in Rome. What is going on in the heart, in the mind, in the feelings of those who are called Levi or Segre, of those who have the name of a city and are linked heart and soul to the people of the Exodus. We ask intellectuals, writers, common people who are experiencing, once again, the nightmare of the uncertainty and of the biblical curse, because of a now generalized condemnation, because of what happened in Beirut, in Lebanon. So, in conclusion, from the analysis of the newspapers coverage of the Lebanese events, three main issues emerge about the image of Israel as conveyed by the press. First of all newspapers tended to detach Israel from the surrounding historical and political context, which mainly appeared as a stage on which Israeli operated. In other words, the actions of the Israeli received prominent or exclusive attention. When mentioned in the press, the various Lebanese groups were simply labeled under general political or ethnic terms. The left wing, the Maronite, the Palestinians, without any information on their political positions or ambitions. The press adopted a similar aphasic representation towards the Palestinians when they were actual victims. This emerged in the accounts of the military operation in West Beirut in an abstract manner as potential targets of the Israelis. Conversely, in reports about the massacres, they appeared either as unburied corpses or small groups of survivors, more often groups of women, mourning for what had happened. On this occasion, the press did not show any interest in their emotional individuality, nor, as was the case for the Lebanese factions, in their political specificity. Instead, they were represented as symbolic victims of the Israeli misdeeds. Secondly, concerning the way the press portrayed Israeli, the analysis revealed
it's fine, you can get it.
Concerning the way the press portrayed Israelis, the analysis revealed that their image was more often built on prejudices toward Israeli leaders' actions and motivation, rather than on an examination of available data and information. Although the Italian newspapers and Le Monde used this approach more often, it was sometimes adopted also by the Times. From the analysis of the press, a set of prejudices about Israel emerges which inform the journalists, affecting their coverage of events and which was presumably shared by the audience the newspapers addressed. These prejudices, although more prominent on the left-wing newspapers, were by no means their exclusive. Instead, they were shared by the conservative, Corriere della Sera and the Times, and on the contrary, on the left-wing, The Guardian, these prejudices were mitigated by a more comprehensive information conveyed by the Manchester newspapers. Finally, the image of another Israel emerged, which was awarded a politic connotation through an ambiguous parallelism between a segment of the Israeli citizenship and the diaspora Jews. The formers were considered as the primary interpreters of the Israeli actions, appearing almost as full characters, taking part in the Lebanese events. The press represented Israel as the land to which diaspora Jews were observed, therefore portraying it as the collective Jew.
Film, of which I'm going to present some preliminary results today. And when I was preparing to write this paper, well, actually when I was halfway done with it, I realized that I'm so used to legitimizing every little argumentative step that this would have taken like almost the most part of the paper already. So I ditched that sketch. I'm realizing that here it's a totally different context. Actually, that's a remarkable thing to say about what it's like to work about anti-Semitism in Germany, and I'm going to say some more about that later, but well, the point is there's an official discourse about anti-Semitism that it's not really present anymore, but at the same time, of course, there is anti-Semitism, and so my work is kind of situated in between this tension, and we've seen a lot of very hateful stuff already, And the things I'm going to present are not as direct, but I want to argue that they still at least connect to anti-Semitic iconography. Yeah, I'm just going to sketch some of the parameters that frame my topic and then give some visual examples because like you have done this, some things that you can only show but not tell. Okay. Because of its past as being the perpetrator country, in Germany the matter of contemporary anti-Semitism is, like I said today, a delicate and contended matter. As a general rule, anti-Semites, well, they usually insist they're not anti-Semitic, so there's always this question of definition. And a friend of mine once said that anti-Semitism is actually, apart from acclaimed scientific definitions, it's one of those things you just know when it comes up, you just feel it. So, well, of course, anti-Semitism is a practice, and it's also, well, physical violence towards people is the obvious face of this practice, but it's also a certain practice of thinking, or as Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno put it, ticket mentality that can manifest quite differently. And the thing we're working on, I think, is it's textual kind of. So it's a textual practice. And why am I talking about anti-Semitic discourse and not just anti-Semitism? Well, all of you probably know the film Jesus from 1940, a horrible propaganda movie. And well, of course, in present Germany, films like that aren't being produced. And if they would, they would probably be prohibited, just as Jesus can only be shown for education purposes today. So contemporary Germany is obviously very different from its Nazi ancestor, and open anti-Semitism is illegitimate. Well, is that so? First of all, as you all probably know very well, there is no one ahistorical anti-Semitism that disappears once it's abolished. Rather, the notion of anti-Semitism my research draws on is one of the very flexible resentment that changes its form according to the circumstances and according to the time. So it originates in modern societies and its antinomies, and that has not changed over time in principle, though power relations certainly have. So in Germany today, according to Lassner, whom we've heard this morning, this noon, I think, and I'm happy to have met you. Well, present anti-Semitism manifests in two main strands in Germany. That's the first of it is we would call it a defense of commemoration in English. We say is that the right term for evidence of it? So it's the pushing away of memory of memory of the Shoah. That's like one main strand. And the other main strand is anti-Israelism. Not very surprisingly, there is anti-Semitism among the German population. So approximately 25 to 50% of the population, depending on the service criteria, hold anti-Semitic views. So it is a phenomenon in the midst of society. It's a mainstream phenomenon. Yet public opinion usually delegitimizes anti-Semitism very quickly. It scandalizes it and marks it as illegitimate. So due to its past and with regard to international relations, in Germany, official policy has to condemn anti-Semitism. So there is this gap between public and private opinion, and anti-Semitism is widely common, but not really directly present in mass media. So in its common forms. So I'm looking at a persisting discourse. That means I'm looking at something that has a continuity, and it is continuity. It is continuous in its being there, and being a certain tradition of images, but they're not represented directly in the media. So it's coded in certain ways. So anti-Semitism in Germany, to summarize some of the presuppositions, is there's a tension between public and private opinion. There's a new nationalism since 1989, since the so-called Union, that has effects on anti-Semitism as well. And we have the official politics of memory on one side, and on the other side there's this latent secondary anti-Semitism and this latent common anti-Israelism. So the question I'm posing in my research is, what is the imagery of anti-Semitism today? Like, in what forms is it represented in contemporary German film? It's kind of a tricky question, of course, because, like I said, it's of course not like before 1945 that it's these very direct, very ugly pictures. But of course it's there. So that's where film as the daydreams of society, as Carper called it, comes into play. Because I want to argue that to take into account this tension between public and private opinion means that looking at film can be very fruitful. Because its power to enable identification and to emotionalize, to bind affection together with it being a mass medium that's distributed, well, at least nationwide, even globally, and not least the very special power of images, as opposed to language, makes film a very important instrument of propaganda and an object for revealing wired, I guess. Okay, let me emphasize 2 points here. First, anti-Semitism in Germany is usually quickly scandalized because there is some evidence that the climate has changed following the so-called reunion, like I said. And second, this assessment only holds true for the traditional forms of anti-Semitism, but not for the younger resentments, as we have seen in the debates following the flotilla and stuff like that. So, what are we looking for when we want to analyze present anti-Semitism in Germany? Well, to summarize roughly the scope of my project, before I'm going to show some pictures, I'm looking at roughly 40 films, all fictional. They're all produced with German money, at least so some of them are co-funded. And they're all either on the topic of National Socialism or on the topic of Israel. And in addition to this thematic limitation, the project, like I said, only investigates fictional from both TV and cinema. Why is that? Well, fictional film is, like I said, it has special features that make the counter analysis maybe its potential to identify. Maybe that's there. Nobody knows. But we have time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So I'm going to tell you a little about this bunch of films that you're looking at, because it's a phenomenon in itself. In the aftermath of the political transformation of Germany since 1989, there's been a striking surge of German or German co-funded films depicting National Socialism since approximately 2001. The first actually was Stalingrad by Joseph Fistmeyer that showed the suffering of German soldiers. It was actually made in 1997. It's a victimizing narrative, but the real massive film started out to come out from 2001. So up to now, there's about 36 films produced for cinema and 5 so-called event movies that were produced by using public funds. They were very, very heavily financed. Let me pre-anticipate my results and so far and tell you that most of these films are produced in the genre of drama, and most of them depict Germans as victims, non-Jewish Germans as victims, and most of them do not show the Holocaust at all. So that's a phenomenon in itself, a victimization discourse in German film. So this wave of filmic narratives can be interpreted as a cultural reaction to the political changes. And regarding this phenomenon, when asking what forms anti-Semitic discourse takes on, well, I'm just using roughly one main category, a dichotomic category that forms the core of anti-Semitism, which is the exchange of roles of victim and perpetrator. So that's mainly what I screen the films on. My results are, on one hand, on the left hand, you can see there's an updating of classic old anti-Semitic motives, like vengefulness, poisoning of walls, treachery, or dehumanization. And then there's a couple of new motives that are particularly interesting because, like I said, that's the question, what's happening with anti-Semitic discourse today. One of it is, like I said, the victimization of non-Jewish Germans by what I call ideological mimesis. I'm going to explain that. Also, the externalization of National Socialism, so it doesn't have to do anything with known Germans. And a phenomenon I would call structural anti-Semitism, that means that characters are, figures are characterized alongside binary codes that are structured by anti-Semitic patterns, let's say, victims and perpetrators. Okay, I'm going to show you some examples of what I mean by ideological nemesis. I've coined this term to name this phenomenon, which is mainly an adaptation to an image that's quite ideological. It's the adaptation to an image. That is the image of Jewish victims of the Holocaust. So there's a double transfer of iconographic Holocaust imagery. It's an imagery everybody knows from the media, and it's transported into only victim narratives of non-Jewish Germans, and now it shows up in cultural artifacts. So this is a shift of certain images that updates traditional stereotypes. Let me show you one. In the movie Discourse, I think in English it's called Ship of No Return, from 2008. I think it was financed with 12 million euros, shown at best prime time. And what you see here is actually not Jewish victims in a concentration camp, but it's Germans trying to enter the harbor to get on a ship. So, I mean, this is quite obvious. It just looks like a concentration camp, right? And I'm not going to have time to show you the film clip, so I'm just using screenshots. Excuse me for that. Just to get an idea, these what you call it, fences they're actually like real historical concentration camp fences. So what I'm not looking at is this authentic or not. I'm just trying to find out what kind of picture is circulating, and this is definitely an interesting phenomenon. So in the movie Dresden, about the bombing of the German city in 1945, you can see it very well happening. But it's the protagonist, Anna, a nurse, on the left. She's wearing this red dress and walking around in this gray debris ruins of Dresden. And obviously, this is what you can see it there. But it just looks like the little girl in the red dress, and she was this. So that's what I mean. It's like it's connecting to imagery everybody knows, to Holocaust imagery everybody knows, and it's very subtle. See, so this is a victimization of non-Jewish Germans. I call ideological nemesis. Another case of ideological nemesis in Dresden is these bodies she walks by. They don't tell you in the movie that it's mainly Jewish people and forced labor workers that were burned like that, because they couldn't enter the secure shelters. So in the movie it looks like it's Germans, non-Jewish Germans that burned like that. In fact, it's sad. It's the real victims. But it's a way of victimization visually that's very subtle, because the image is authentic, but it's decontextualized. You don't get to hear about true historical context. You just see the images, and it's dramatic, and you hear the music, and it just works. Okay, so that's ideological nemesis. And then what I found is that usually in those movies, the good and the bad, victim and the perpetrator, or the hero and the bad guys, they are usually characterized alongside anti-Semitic structure. On the left, you see the hearing or victim, Erika Balechki and Gustav. And on the right, it's the bad guy. Actually, interestingly, there's two truly fictitious figures in that movie. That's, apart from that, it's pretty documentary, but it's very close to historic facts. But this guy on the right, and that was just invented to give a reason for why the ship sank, why the ship could have been torpedoed by the Russians. In reality, nobody knows why it could have been, but why it was possible to be torpedoed. So this character is actually, it's not openly Jewish, but it's characterized as being, he doesn't want to work, he's very lazy. He's lecturers and at the same time impotent, and he's the traitor figure. So you have this dichotomy of this heroine who wants to sacrifice herself for the community. The blonde, she's actually working in the military, but she's the heroine, and like I said, she wants to sacrifice herself, and that's a very common motive in Nazi ideology, as well as in those films. People go for martyrdom. People want to sacrifice themselves, and the bad people, well, they're being characterized alongside a certain combination of anti-Semitic stereotypes. So that's what I would call structural anti-Semitism. Leipzig, and it shows Romania, the Aryan woman being raped by this, what do you call this? Octopus? Yeah, this octopus-like Jewish threat. So that's a typical fantasy and anti-Semitic imagery that was very common during that time. And now in the movie Anonymous, this kind of imagery is brought up by a blonde woman that's the hero and the victim of the movie being raped, and this is shown in detail, being raped by this Bolshevik. And as you all probably know, anti-Semitism kind of mixes up images of, well, Jews being at the same time Bolshevik and too liberal and stuff like that. So it's very subtle and it's kind of indirect, but it connects to a certain kind of iconography that is still there, that many people grew up with. Okay. Then there's, like I said, Dehumanization. This is the one book I have that's very short. It's from Discourse, a 4.5-hour, 3-part, public-funded movie about the story of the German family, Discourse. It's a horrible movie. And I'm very sorry for the evaluation of my program burned down, so I had to use this really quickly. So what we see is the German hero, Alfred Krupp, walking around his debris plant. And what I want to show you is how Jewish women in this movie are being depicted. Please try to ignore the wrong picture. It's an update of a certain way of dehumanizing. And we only know that just because they're wearing a star, which doesn't really make sense because if they were hiding, they would be wearing a star. And coming to an end. Very last example of anti-Israelism. Again, victims of perpetrators in Paradise Now. Also German movie, German script. On the left you see the victims or heroes of the movie. They're all kind of European slacker like Palestinians, these smoking guys who want to blow up themselves because they don't know what else to do. On the right there's the bad guys. It's the Israelis, and we don't get to know them. We don't get to really see their faces or see who they are. They're dehumanized and they're only shown as role model perpetrators. So that's an example of anti-Israelism. strand in contemporary American, contemporary German film. So, okay, this might not be as hateful and as direct as all the other stuff, but it's Germany, so it can be. So I just want to end by saying film shapes reality. And even if the connection of anti-Semitism in film is not as clear and direct as in YIISA, still it provides visual material for notions of reality and for notions about other people, and I think it's still very important to watch out that those are accurate.
Would leap the fence of historical fact and concern for victims and survivors, not to mention leap the guidelines developed by educators and museums. Nowhere is this escape more apparent than in recent Holocaust films, particularly Quentin Tarantino's goofy paean to sadistic violence in Glorious Bastards, and the homiletic novel and film The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, illustrations of which you see there. In the past few years, popular Holocaust movies have been luring audiences with promises of life is beautiful, as in the case of Roberto Benigni's Oscar-winning film, which was promoted as an unforgettable fable that proves love, family, and imagination conquer all. Or in the case of the film Defiance, sold with the message, war and destruction has never been so captivating and moving. As reviewer Owen Gleiberman assesses this phenomenon, and now I'm going to quote from him, the old line on Holocaust dramas was that no film, regardless of how serious, could ever truly capture the horror. These days, you would have to look far and wide to find a Holocaust movie that even tries to capture the full, unimaginable horror. The subject may be survivors' guilt gone mad, a rescue mission to assassinate Hitler, a mission impossible to assassinate Hitler, or a death camp guard's sexiness and secret shame. But in this season of grimly hooky Third Reich parables, it's hard to shake the feeling that the Holocaust has turned from the ultimate furrow-browed movie theme into a genre with its own built-in flowers of evil mystique. Rarely has genocide been put to the service of so much unabashed entertainment. I'd like to explore what difference popular mass audience Holocaust movies makes to our thinking about the limits of Holocaust representation in relation to critical discourses on anti-Semitic imagery. Holocaust films may win reverent applause on Oscar night and hushed audience approval, but it is precisely because of this that they have become suspect. A January 2010 New York Times article noted that it may not have been a coincidence that with Hanukkah having just been celebrated and Holocaust Memorial Day coming up, a spate of Holocaust movies opened within the month, including Defiance, The Reader, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and Valkyrie. This response begs the questions of whether the problem is too much Holocaust or what messages about the Jews and Jewish Holocaust are being represented. After all, European surveys show growing irritation at the perceived guilt trip being perpetuated by endless stories of Jewish victimization. In the light of this backlash, is it possible that even as recent films show increasingly complex approaches to Holocaust stories, including Nazi horror, that some express resistance to universal moral responsibility for the fate of the Jews? From the critical perspective of genre and audience appeal, several of these movies question their own serious engagement with the implications of such questions by shaping their narratives with features of pop culture melodrama. They're plot and action-driven emphasizing suspense and the romantic glow and tensions of heroic adventure and adventurous love. They mystify horror rather than explore it. For many critics, such stories leave audiences understanding the Holocaust story as a chilling but satisfying thriller, starring heroically handsome Jews and carrying the message of the triumph of hope over adversity, of individual agency over totalitarianism, of innocence over evil. The problem is that such lessons and moral pieties betray how exceptional these stories are. They betray the realities of 6 million terrorized Jews and an additional 5 million others who never had a chance to resist or to be rescued. Even if it's just a plot ploy, the effect of glamorizing, sentimentalizing, and eroticizing Holocaust representation is to trivialize not only the atrocities, but the fact that the Jewish victims were constructed as a race to destroy. To dismiss and therefore obscure the centrality of this fact certainly contributes to the accessibility of Holocaust stories by creating a universalizing portrait with which audiences can easily identify. But of course, this would ignore the particularities of Jewish identity, culture, and history as targets of destruction and erasure. The implications of such suppositions are highlighted by the fate of darker Holocaust stories, those that depict the repellent and unadventurous trajectory of despair, death, and disillusionment, because those usually appeal to limited audiences doomed to short runs in art houses. Such is the case of Faithlessness, the film adaptation of Nobel Prize winner Imre Kertész's autobiographical novel, which in shades of gray and taupe depicts the unrelenting mud, roll calls, and backbreaking work of a 15-year-old Hungarian Jewish boy surviving several camps with neither will nor wile and returning to face loss and a bleak, uncertain future. As both the Kertész novel and film demonstrate, as opposed to popular filmmakers, Holocaust survivor artists struggle to find the language and forms through which to bear witness to their experiences. In short, to even achieve accessibility. The problem, as survivor artists tell us, is that no written, visual, or spoken language or conventional genre can convey a clear, concise picture of the unprecedented, unimaginable horrors of the camps. As French political prisoner Charlotte Delvaux pleads with her readers, try and look, just try and see. She doesn't say, come and look, here it is, big as life and twice as real, for you to ponder. No, she knows better. My case study today will be the most recent example of popular acclaim for a Holocaust story, John Boyne's 2006 novel, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and the 2008 film adaptation. Boyne calls his novel a fable, a simple tale with an agreeably accessible moral lesson. Here's the plot. Having been promoted to Camp Commandant, an SS officer moves his wife, 8-year-old son Bruno, and 12-year-old daughter Gretel from their graciously traditional Berlin home to a modernist, no-frills house bordering the gates of Auschwitz. Denoting his innocent ignorance and endearing him to audiences with his baby talk, Bruno calls the camp Auschwitz and their leader, the Fury. Deprived of school and friends, both children are beset with loneliness, but the perspective is Bruno's. One day, as fables will have it, Bruno discovers a door at the back of their garden and wanders along the perimeter of the barbed wire fence to discover on the other side Shmuel, a Jewish boy in striped pajamas. Among Bruno's many discoveries as he engages Shmuel in friendly conversation through the fence is that they share the same birthday and sadness about leaving their nice homes and friends behind. As the boys' friendship intensifies, so does the momentum of the plot, which carries them inexorably along to their shared tragic end. Discovering no difference between the boys and their fates, both the plot and Bruno make sure he digs a hole under the fence, dons a pair of borrowed striped pajamas, and the boys are swept away along with the other male prisoners, hand in hand, to the gas chamber. The ad for the film features the subtitle, "Lines May Divide Us, but Hope Will Unite Us." The website for the film has a discussion guide featuring a page of objectives for youth, including the following: the essence of true friendship, the courage to engage in humane activities, the uses and abuses of obedience and conformity, the development and consequences of prejudice and discrimination. Note the universal message in these objectives, clearly well-intended, and I'm thinking here now of David Hirsch's talk this morning about intentionality. Clearly well-intended, one that appeals to young and old alike and to the best sense of ourselves. After the preponderance of victim stories in other venues, we now have a chance to understand the perpetrator as human, not a monster, not sick, not an abstract symbol of evil. We are shown a Nazi family that, except for father's SS uniform, we recognize as ordinary, educated, upper middle class, and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in a time of war. Sibling rivalry, marital tensions, loss of home and friends. Creating an interesting equivalency, this theme is not unlike the story that Anne Frank tells about her family. So I ask, is this a problem, and how do we identify it and analyze it? As with Anne's story, history interferes with the fantasy that innocence triumphs over evil. First, Bruno and Shmuel could never meet on opposite sides of the fence. Shmuel would more likely have been one of the 1.5 million Jewish children murdered along with his mother for representing the poisonous regeneration of the Jewish people. The fence would have been electrified and guarded by attack dogs and their SS leaders. But it's what the film does show, despite its good intentions about equality under the skin, that hints at the fable's complicity with racial ideology. In the film, Shmuel has a shaved head and broken and missing teeth. Because he is never shown as normal or healthy, audiences have no way of knowing that he was ever any other way. Neither movie nor novel indicates in realist, symbolist, or other figurative language that his abject appearance is a result of being a victim of starvation and beatings and not a race apart. Except for one scene where he's shown with a black eye as a result of being hit by a young, impetuous SS officer, we only see him at the fence, surrounded by an antiseptically clean field. No other prisoners, no mud, no filth, no ashes. Bruno has big blue eyes and a winning smile. He's a beautiful and charming child. His entire family is beautiful and fit. Until the end, when they are overcome with grief, their appearance is idealized throughout the film. They are the master race. Unlike the portrait of Shmuel, a static character who nothing seems to affect, the film focuses on the dramatic change that befalls Bruno's family. While the novel and movie race inexorably rapidly towards their climactic end, with rapid intercuts between the boys being catapulted towards the gas chambers and the frantic search for Bruno, there is no narrative expression of loss on behalf of the Jews. By contrast, the film's coda dwells on Bruno's family. A shot from above hovers over Elsa, sinking to her knees at the sight of Bruno's clothing and wailing in pain. As the camera cuts, and I don't have a shot of this, to the commandant's panicked and grief-stricken face, it exhorts the audience to empathize with his moral and emotional epiphany. Through the mother's abject grief and father's panic, we are made to view the Nazi family as suffering a human tragedy. Author John Boyne and director Mark Harmon have succeeded in making the Holocaust accessible to all, and out of its history created a perspective that universalizes the Nazi family as another human interest story worthy of audiences' identification and acceptance into the realm of our moral and emotional norms. At the same time as the sympathetic Nazi perspective is stretching the limits of Holocaust representation, the classic perspective is being transformed. Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds, anybody here seen it? Okay, good. Casts Jewish survivors as autistic, avenging devils whose assassination of Nazi perpetrators is depicted as rivaling Nazi methods in its savagery. Not satisfied with clubbing Nazi guards and officers to death, the Jewish avengers offer their own imprimatur. They scalp their victims. As with much of the film's narrative ploys, this gesture pays homage to classic Hollywood filmmaking, in this case the cowboy and Indian epic. But of course, what's happening in Tarantino's revision is that the lawlessness of the American West is transported to the European West, where the reference to the savage Indian overwhelms any sense of Jewish victimization or righteous resistance and becomes the signifier of Jewish justice. The anti-Semitic stereotype of the Jewish scalper, i.e. pawnbroker and so forth, is reborn as we watch him literally take his pound of flesh while his autistic grunts subsume centuries of Jewish literacy, commentary, and debate. Because the subject of Holocaust representation must be incomprehensible horror, making its stories accessible through familiar emotional registers, narrative forms, and images continues to be an educational imperative. Museums, memoirs, and Holocaust children's books provide guides that create a coherent narrative to lead audiences through historical events and human suffering. Most popular Holocaust films create even greater accessibility. Advertised as heartwarming tributes to the triumph of love, heroism, and self-sacrifice, they are most often about atypical stories of survival that universalize the subject and erase the ongoing trauma of Jewish victimization and anti-Semitism. I'd like to argue that the problem for popular Holocaust films is how they contribute to a mythically comforting public memory of the event. Tarantino presents us with a Holocaust story that blends seamlessly with audience memories, not of Holocaust history, but of Tarantino's earlier films. As reviews show, audiences responded to Inglourious Basterds as though it were Pulp Fiction meeting Kill Bill, a slapstick send-up of both historical investigation and uplifting fiction. Inglourious Basterds uses Holocaust history and testimony as a graphic opportunity for the postmodern filmmaker. It mocks an assumed ethical responsibility to historical documentation and authenticity as shop-worn academic cliché by celebrating travesty as an authentic form of Holocaust art. In so doing, the film overturns the historical and moral opposition between Jewish victimization and Nazi perpetration, as well as the testimonial value of any Holocaust representation. Indeed, having worn out their welcome as passive victims, Jews are now artistic candidates for acceptability. They can gratify audiences' thirst for vicarious, violent fun by fulfilling the anti-Semitic stereotype lurking under the cover of parody. Considered together, both films remind us how Holocaust representation situates artist and audience as collaborators in addressing questions about the responsibility of collective Holocaust memory that have not been resolved and perhaps cannot be. It is in this sense that Holocaust movies must defy the promises of escapist fantasy. Its stories can entice mass audiences to endure the journey, but along the way, those promises must be